Good afternoon. My name is Roland Erne, as they call me in Ireland. I'm a visiting fellow here at the moment at the Jump Institute at the Scuola, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this little symposium to launch our book. The book, Politicizing Commodification, European Governance and Labour Politics from the Financial Crisis to the COVID Emergency. You can download it for free on our website and also in the SNS catalog and any other catalog, UI catalog, as it is open access. And the book summarizes 6 years of work with my colleagues. Two of them are here, Darragh, who will be chairing the first session, our colleague in the Department of HRM and Employment Relations in Universität, and Vincenzo Maccarrone, who will be chairing the second session, who is now Global Marie Curie Fellow in this school. We won't have a long introduction because we organized this panel to hear what you have to say about our work. But it's always good to know where we are coming from. And this book would not have been possible with me having the doubtful privilege of living interesting times in Ireland during the Troika years. And as you will see when you read the book, the first sentence of the book is a quote of a young, dynamic representative of the Troika, namely a DG ECFIN representative who was representing the Commission at kind of peace talks that the ILO organized, bringing together the social partners, gray-haired men from employers' associations and trade unions, gray-haired ministers of labor, the ILO people, and then this young, dynamic Troika representatives, and also some academics. So colleague Lucio Baccaro challenged, now we have all in the same room, he challenged the Troika and said, you are wrong with your recipes because we have the market, neoliberalism doesn't work. And then our Troika representative from DG ECFIN stood up and said, yes, you're completely right. We thought that the market the creation of a common market, the creation of a monetary union would create horizontal market pressures that would lead to the necessary adjustments of social policies, industrial relations policies. But instead, we had these macroeconomic imbalances that threatened to break up the euro. That's why we are now here. So now we have to do with political interventions what the market failed to do. And that is what our commission president at the time, also in Florence at Padilla, said, we are doing a silent revolution. We are now intervening in areas where only a year before, when we did a survey of employers' representatives and labor representatives and government, what they excluded, namely horizontal and vertical interventions in the field of employment and labor policies, and also in the field of healthcare policies. So that is a big shift. And as we have seen, when you have vertical interventions, the whole European economic integration regime gets much more visible and therefore also much easier to politicize. But it can be politicized in different ways. It can be politicized in a national against EU dimension, leading to Brexit. But it could also be politicized along a left-wing kind of axis. We call it commodification, decommodification axis to render social services, public utilities, and also employment relations more market-like, more or less market-like. And the way how this politicization is happening is influenced what policy orientation the new economic governance prescriptions took. So we analyzed the new economic governance prescriptions for the Troika countries, but also for the Eastern European countries that also had memorandum of understanding. And then in 2011, for all countries that were now part of the institutionalized version of the so-called EU new economic governance regime after the adoption of the so-called six-pack on economic governance, which made these interventions possible. So we looked at the policy orientations, which shows 4 countries that are representatives for the 4 corners of Europe, 2 small and 2 big countries, also having different places in the integrated but also uneven economic governance regime, Italy, Germany, Ireland, and Romania, to see what patterns are emerging. Is there a unified commodification pattern across all countries? But also what patterns are emerging in different fields? Employment relations, public services, but then also water services, healthcare services, and public transport to see the dimensions in these different fields. So very pleased for having us here in the first place, and I hand over to Donatella Della Porta, who will start our panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Roland, and thanks to all of you for the privilege to presenting your book here at the Scuola. I will start with the praise and go on not with the critique, but with some questions coming from the perspective I'm taking in reading this very rich book, especially from the angle of social movement studies and the transnationalizations of labor as transnationalizations of an important social movements that's, to which you have devoted a lot of attention in this book. And the first praise also helped me bridging this presentation with your Ciampi chair lecture a few weeks ago, in which some of the comments by colleagues were referring to the relatively small numbers of protest events in comparison with the many protests that are present at the local level, but also at the national level. And as you know, I do not share that critique, because having studied protest at the European level, I know that each event which is prepared, mounted, launched, and performed at the European level involved a huge number of events that in the logic of protest event analysis are often not considered, but makes each of the protest events that you have listed in the various chapters of your book extremely important, and in some way also potentially path-breaking, because they also contribute to the constructions of structures, mutual understanding, and also the constructions of an idea of what Europe could be. So it is not by counting only that you realize the importance of this event. And something that emerged already in previous research is that the investment of resources to develop protest at the European level is also often proficus for social movements in order to acquire a broader vision and broader capacity to intervene. So invest resources, but get a lot of networking capacity, collective framings, and the idea of another Europe which I think emerges quite strongly also from the more specific struggles that you have analyzed around two big issues and three sectors. And in social movement studies, in fact, what we saw is that often protests on Europe take different paths, but that they eventually interact in the productions of transnational activities. So in the beginning, a lot of protests were called protests through path of domestications, in the sense that the important impact of EU policies were resisted at the local level. Farmers' protests were typical of this. But also that there was a lot of externalization, so the attempt to use EU policies to solve issues, and in the environmental politics, especially in the periphery, there was the hope that the EU could contribute to improve the opportunities, especially for countries in which environmental issues were less considered. What especially this research pointed at is that scale shift from the local to the national and the European are very widespread and feeding each other, with each campaigning also contributing to the development of new languages, new styles, new translations. I remember the other day that I think the first time I met Roland was at a conference in UCD in which trade unionists also met and explained their concerns and challenges when they met people from different countries, not knowing which languages they have to speak. And I think that all these type of campaigns contribute to build these structures that become more and more useful and easy to mobilize. So I think it is a fundamental contribution. I was thinking something that I wanted to suggest and discuss with you. You use the ideas of Polanyian counter-movements, especially, to describe the various forms of protest that in the long historical perspective have addressed issues like public Fortunately, it was not the book. And so you show that there have been a lot of resistance to what is for sure a very, in the analysis that you present, a very strong push towards neoliberal policies in all the areas. So I was mentioning public services and all the specific reflections you make on water, health, and other types. And you say the unions have resisted, like Polanyi type of counter-movements, defending the citizenship rights, civil rights, social rights, political rights, faced to the neoliberal project. I was wondering if maybe also a lesson from your analysis is that there was also something more at times than a Polanyian counter-movement, that there was more what Beverly Silver calls Marxist moments, contrasting them with Polanyi's moment in the sense of the development of some broader visions, and also some attempt, failed or partially successful, to develop an alternative visions, not only referring to the past, but also referring to potential innovations in the future. On water, for instance, the idea of the commons, but also in general on services and welfare state. Often the idea that has emerged in this campaign is that it is not just a matter going back to state as decommodification force, but that you also need some alternative conceptions. And to which extent the unions participated in this process and to which extent this tended to change in the different moments is, I think, interesting to reflect upon, also to see if the weakness and the challenges that you single out could be addressed through broader perspective than just defending the past. And there, I think, you show very well the traits of a Europeanization process that has taken more and more the idea of commodification as the main perspective, and how in different forms sometimes unions were able to resist but pushed more and more to the margins, to the point that made me already quite pessimistic about the European Union, even more pessimistic in the sense that if this is the trend, why should the unions support this type of policies? And in several moments of the book, you also show that the support for the European ideas have tamed the actions of the unions, brought them inside negotiations in which they were on the losing side. So I think that also these broader questions about the general options, how much can you push, because is an important one, because it seems that some of the victories of the unions were strange byproducts of the Brexit, in the sense that the Brexit was the threat that opened options for at least the symbolic decommodification moves. And so I think that here it's interesting also to see to which extent the general attitudes of the unions could constitute also a push towards another visions if they were more decided into the also critique of the European Union. Because in your analysis, it seems that then the unions tend to go back to previous position, renounce to struggles because they don't want to break a sort of equilibrium. Which could be the resources for this type of improvement of the chances of the unions that I found in your book? Reading it through the lenses of resources of power, also of the unions at the transnational level, but also variations of the political opportunities at the EU level. I thought that your comparative analysis of the different campaigns shows some use of resources. So there are structural resources on transport, communications, and aviation policies. You also describe the structural strength of some of these categories that helped them stopping some type of projects. So this, I think, is important for the unions to take into account and to use it. But also it seems institutional type of sources. And this is something that emerged with the Bolkestein directive that we studied with Louisa Parks. Also in terms of how the different institutions certain policies go through tend to produce also successful different strategies according the type of DG that makes the decisions, according to when the parliament decides, according to who is in charge of the European Council at the moment, and so on. But also I thought there are movements resources, so social type of resources that emerged very clearly in your research, especially on water and health, which is in the pictures that you put on the cover of the book. And then higher pay, more staff, and no commercializations, no applause is not enough on care issues. I think shows also how the potential for alliances with broader social movements can play an important role. And this in terms of what I was saying before of introducing and alternative visions to the Polanyian's counter-movements could also mean involving social movements, but also involving consumers and on the health issues, on the water issues in Ireland as in Italy, it's also quite clear. And the union strength is another type of power that you show was relevant, especially from the public employees. And not more so much the private type of enterprises, but for the public employees was important. So concluding, on the type of challenges, unions are very divided. This emerged as a challenge, so the fact that at the national level, it seems to me that the challenge of bringing together German trade unions with other trade unions is still very open, not only because interests diverge, but also because of conceptions of unionism and experiences of interactions with the other social movements that have very different characteristics in the different countries. So what is transnationalizations in terms of organizational networks, action repertoires, and framing is, I think, a central point also to address this alternative between Polanyi-driven movement and Marx-driven movements in Beverly Silver approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Donatella, and impeccable timekeeping. Our next speaker, but firstly, I'd just like to welcome everybody who's online. So thanks for turning up for this book launch symposium. Next speaking, we have Stefanie Hürtgen from, she's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Geography at the University of Salzburg. Stefanie is a founding member of the Labour Geography Working Group of the German Geographical Society and an elected member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation. Stefanie, 15 minutes. The floor is all yours, and we look forward to your contribution. Yes, I'll restart.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. Also from my side, I also have a lot of praises. Or I should make a lot of praises, but I want to concentrate this first to say that I will use your book in my teaching. I make regular teaching about Europe, and I think it's very important what you did is to rebind the European question, the social European question, the social Europe, to the labor movement. And for example, there's a little remark that after 45, the labor movement after fascism, so to say, was strong. And we did forget this, it seems to me. And so the whole question of to have a different Europe, to have social, juridical possibilities of socialization, for example, as we have in the Berlin case of of habitation, all this comes from movements after World War II. And you have this little remark, and the whole book is, as I said, do you want to change him? First, no? Okay. As I said, to rebind it to labor movement. So very important, just to concentrate my praise. My intervention will be more conceptual-like. So I have to concentrate because of time. And I want to make three conceptual remarks. The first one will be the longest one. It is the basic one, so to say. And it has the title, Competition State and the globalization of work and production. So the term globalization is important, and competition state. You, Roland and Darragh and the others, you speak about regime competition, which is very important, of course, but I think you do not use the term competition state as far as I saw. Joachim Hirsch and Czerny in Germany and Czerny in UK developed the term competition state then already in the beginning of the 90s. Later it became Schumpeterian workfare state by Bob Jessop, if some of you know this. The competition state, in a nutshell, is the formation or the reorganization of a society along its supply function for transnational corporations, transnational financial capital, and the supranational donors, foundations, etc. Why I think this term competition state is important, also for your perspective. There are 3 reasons, I'm still on the first point, but 3 reasons for this. The first is because with the term competition state, you got into view the very authoritarian logic which is inherent to competition states. Jamie Peck is one of the famous to precisely work this out. I very much liked the author's reluctance to national and European dualism, to national and European, scale jumping. This is very important. However, it seems to me that sometimes this authoritarian logic is not really considered. It seems to start only with the NEG politics. Sometimes the distinction of the horizontal and the vertical, I think, is a bit misleading, because authoritarian politics did exist before, and the term competition state reminds us that marketization is political and often authoritarian against trade unions, etc. The second reason, and this leads to geography, why I think competition state is important as a concept, as a term, as a notion, is that the authoritarian competition, competitive Europeanization, is based on the national, but also the sub-national fragmentation. This is what in particular Neil Brenner analyzed, and why he speaks about, I quote, glocalizing European competition states. This means that rising national and intranational uneven development belong together. Hereby, this is often made misunderstanding, hereby the national state is not disappearing. On the contrary, the national state is the backbone of this multi-scalar European configuration, as it shapes or even pushes for subnational deregulation and fosters local and regional competition to enhance competitive advantages. So we have side competition or the appearance of inner peripheries also in rich countries like, for instance, Germany. And all this is important, as we all know, to circumvent methodological nationalism. So the glocal is important when it comes to the competition state following Neil Brenner. The third reason for the concept of the competition state is that with the notion of the glocal authoritarian competition state, you can grasp even better what you line out or what you underline, which is the homology between European and TNC, so transnational corporations, governance. This homology is very important, I think, and it should even be strengthened conceptually, because Europeanization is also about the social and the spatial reconfiguration of labor processes and production processes. So with the global perspective, we get into view the reconfiguration or rescaling, as we say in geography, of labor and production processes. Localization here is a term that is very helpful for both state and TNC reconfiguration. So TNC is transnational corporations reconfiguration. In both state and TNC governance, there's an upscaling, social and spatial generalization of norms like labor's competitiveness, flexibility, and employability. and at the same time a downscaling of its reproductive and social security interests. In both, there is a quantitative authoritarian digital surveillance and governance from the European scale down to the very individual one, up down to the workplace where the working steps are monitorized and compared across workplaces, subsidiaries, regions, nation states, and so on. Differently said, in both European and TNC governance, there is socio-spatial fragmentation as the form and the very form of the actual neoliberal Europeanization. So downscaling and upscaling belong together. To sum up, localizing European competition states are important as a notion, I think, to grasp the authoritarian character of the marketization, its multi-scalar character, and to grasp the homology with the local TNC governance. So this was the first conceptual point. The two others are kind of conclusions or consequences. First or second conceptual suggestion, I think this dualism between the national and the European that you underlined, which I think is really important, we also have to take this in consideration when it comes to subjective and political attitudes and movements on workers' and trade union sides. For example, in the study of European Works Councils, this juxtaposition between the national and the European was very common. Nearly the whole literature asked for how to overcome national orientations in favor of European consciousness. But in a multi-scalar perspective, you cannot separate the European from the national and vice versa, and the local and so on. Also, a national position frames the European one in a particular competitive way. I give an example. The silence of most European trade unions with regard to the pension reform protests in France more or less 1 year ago is European policy. It is the decision not to engage in European solidarity activism, to leave alone trade unions in France. So political actions and consciousness is a priori multiscalar. Third remark, third conceptual suggestion, when it comes to transnational solidarity, and I mean, you have many important things in it. Nevertheless, I think we have to add the question, what is the content of that solidarity? On what issue, on what basis do or should workers come together to be solidaric in actions and counter pressure and so on? On what issues they could come together? You very much underlined the working conditions and the provision of social infrastructures, public services, and so on, and I, of course, agree with that. I mean, no doubt this is very important. However, in a feminist perspective, and you have it in with the hospitals and the care thematic, I would add we should not leave out the notion, the meaning of work. Lots of movements, working class movements or workers' movements in a large sense now, are not only about pay and working conditions and public services, but they are also about the dignity to make the work properly, usefully, and with a sense for others in society. In this perspective, the feminist or the care movements are in a way the avant-garde, I would say, of today's social conflicts. And I think we should add that when it comes to transnational movements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefanie, for that contribution, which certainly food for thought. Next speaker, we have Anton Hemerijck, who's a professor of political science and sociology at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the EUI. He also joined the European Commission's newly formed high-level group on the future of social protection and of the welfare state in October 2021. And he has also, hot off the press, has a book published with Oxford University Press called Who's Afraid of the Welfare State Now? So he's co-authored that with Magnus Matsaganis. Anton, 15 minutes, the floor is yours, and I will give you just a 1 minute notice to ask you to conclude. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. The book that just came out has a rhetorical title, Who's Afraid of the Welfare State? And the basic message is nobody is afraid of the welfare state anymore, or nobody should be afraid. That's a Whiggish book, and your book is much more bold and radical in that respect. And we cover the same period, but the approach is very different. So the three things that I take away from your book is that the new EU economic governance moves from, let's say, horizontal benchmarking to vertical steering, which is a little bit more intrusive. I'd like to come back to them if we go back to the Washington Consensus, yes or no, in that respect. Then, with respect to the two crises, you basically make the point that there is more commodification than decommodification overall. And then when it comes to the timing of the crisis, you argue there's a little more decommodification in the wake of the pandemic in comparison to that of the Great Recession. Now I'm going to make a different contribution, and it's one that is critical in the sense that it will spark a debate, and this has to do with decommodification. And Just Esping Andersen did a great job to reintroduce after Polanyi decommodification and trying to understand sort of the history of the welfare state. But as we move into the 21st century, the politics of the welfare state is no longer about decommodification, either commodification. It's really about capacitation. And it's interesting that Justa kind of gave up on decommodification after 2001 when he basically argued, look, the problem is not, we have big welfare states, but there's an aging population and a knowledge economy. That means we need, the human capital and the employment numbers in order to pay for the decommodifying pensions, which are very popular, and therefore we need to enable, capacitate families with children to participate in the labor market in a civilizing way, which brings me to T.H. Marshall, which plays a big role in your book. And for T.H. Marshall, it was always to live the life of a civilized human being according to the standards prevailing in the societies. And as times and demography and the economy changes, to live the life of a civilized human being changes as well. So it's no longer about male breadwinner job protection. It's really about, well, the shorthand of it is social investment. So when the role of women and demography changes radically, everything changes. And then the question is whether decommodification is really the proper way to assess the quality of our social systems. The first point. My second point is that you kind of make the argument that the Great Recession reinforced commodification rather than decommodification or something more civilizing. But the fact of the matter is that the Great Recession really did a tremendously good job in absorbing the economic and social aftershocks of the crisis. And those countries with the more inclusive social protection system, unemployment benefits and social assistance, they both buffered really well at the macro level of the economy and also at the micro level of poor households where buffers really matter. Then the more Nordic-oriented, but that includes now also Germany and like Austria and the Netherlands, which are more capacity building, also sort of jump back into very high levels of employment that are required in order to pay for pensions. And that was then reinforced by whatever it takes, heterodox monetary policy coming from Mario Draghi. And I find it very difficult to put that sort of policy response, which I think was relatively adequate, into the categories of commodification, decommodification. I'd like to hear more. Then it is true that, COVID changes once again everything, and these lockdown restrictions were, of course, imperative in order to buy time to develop vaccines. And that reinforced the strengthening of safety nets along the model of short-term work schemes that were popular also in the Great Recession, particularly in Germany, and also the Stability and Growth Pact was, escaped, and then with New Generation EU, there's an element of fiscal solidarity, and I agree with you, there is more decommodification going on in this latter period, but I think this argument could have been expanded a little bit more. So from my perspective, following Marshall in a way, so what is it to live the life of a civilized human being in the 21st century? You have to look at, poverty rates, and if you do the numbers, basically poverty rates are low, where unemployment and social assistance benefits are generous, and these are also the countries that are the most competitive in the EU. The stabilizers worked in the more inclusive economies, and in a way you can think of welfare states in terms of the coverage of social protection and the adequacy of social protection. And then there's a group of countries that really stand out in terms of the buffering quality protection system. This actually also includes France, the Netherlands. Anyway, so then you can ask yourself the rhetorical question. So is this the same welfare state as Beveridge and Keynes anticipated? And I would say no. It's a completely different welfare state. It's one that is a more capacitating welfare state, where early childhood education and care are important. Investment in education along the life course is important. Active labor market policy, and active aging and flexible retirement. These are those are the countries with the more inclusive buffers that are also able to deliver high levels of employment, that are also required for financial and fiscal stability. And in this respect, it's very interesting to see that, the massive shock, well, it was a recession, wasn't it? A depression. Of the recession, there are many signs of progress. Female employment went up, the gender pay gap went down largely, participation in formal childcare went up everywhere in the EU. At risk of poverty came down during the Great Recessions. And yes, as a correlate, spending went up, but to the extent that employment rates were high, the welfare state was expensive, yes, but also effective, popular, and entirely affordable. And this shows that when we think about the welfare state, we often think about let's say, the adult population who have a chance of losing a job and then falling back from unemployment and social assistance. So we have a rather limited understanding of where the welfare state is active. So only in the adult working population period. But I would say you have to take the whole life course into consideration, from early childhood to education, to labor markets, to work-life balance. And then you see there's a positive multiplier function at work, that at each stage of the life course, when these capacitating and also compensating policies are at place, the welfare state works pretty well. Now let's come back to the European dimension here, and you make this distinction, more commodifying in the Great Recession. I'm not so sure. More decommodifying in the wake of COVID-19. I think there are three periods here. The first was the shock came, and there was clearly a conservative reflex on the part of the Barroso administration, but also on the part of Sarkozy and Merkel and everybody else, blaming the welfare state for for the shock that was created by the banking system, really. This paradigm got contested as of 2012, also within the European Commission by Laszlo Andor. So the paradigm was contested because there were major social imbalances that we saw appearing in that period. There was a social investment package, which was a little bit of a sort of lip service to the social investment idea without, recognizing the importance of buffers. But then later you have the European Pillar of Social Rights, which is very clear about, the buffers being a sine qua non to any kind of effective social investment welfare state. So lo and behold, you have the weakening of the expansionary austerity paradigm that was kind of displaced by the social investment package a little bit, but more strongly with the European Pillar of Social Rights. And there was a very strong commitment from the European Commission, both from Juncker and von der Leyen. I mean, mind you, Juncker used to say, we know exactly what to do, but we don't know how to get reelected. But basically, he acknowledged that they didn't know what to do, let alone know how to get there. I'll finish on this score. So in the traditional way of looking at decommodification and the welfare state basically as a tool of redistribution, we often look at sort of the number of citizens that are on welfare provision, the unemployed, poor families on social assistance, and then we think about their average levels of consumption or the benefit and the services that they have, and then both on the left and on the right, there are those who say the benefits are too high and that makes people lazy, or they are too low, etc. But that's very much the political debate. So, but that equation, that's the nominator. It's very important to think about the denominator. So basically, the number of people who are on benefits, that is being provided for following a collective insurance model by the numbers of people who work and their average levels of productivity. And what is this? The shift in the 21st century is from nominator politics or nominator political bargaining or electoral competition to denominator governance, because these are big welfare states, and this also applies to Italy and Meloni. So once you enter government, you are forced to shift your orientation to the denominator, to think about the people who can be employed, older workers, women, what they need to have gainful employment, such as childcare. So there's a shift from nominator politics to denominator governance that takes seriously the whole life course, because as I said before, once women enter the labor market, everything changes.
Thank you, Anton, for that contribution. So our final speaker, thank you, Jonathan, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Is this on? Yes. Listen, let me apologize. I simply got the time wrong. I thought I was early for something that began at 3 o'clock, so I would have liked to have heard the other speakers. I think what I have to say follows very nicely on from Anton, however. So I'm going to focus my comments on the book's analysis of what we could call the social dimension of EU economic governance on employment policy, industrial relations, and healthcare. Now, I think that over the past 10 years, there has emerged a fairly consensual sort of mainstream narrative about the evolution of EU socioeconomic governance. It runs something like this, and it's, obviously I think it's linked to the thesis of the socialization of the European semester, which Bart and Van Herk and I put forward for the first time in 2013, 2014. And it fits a little bit the timing that Anton described. So for the first couple of years following the beginnings of the Euro crisis, we have the construction of the European semester and a sort of predominance of retrenchment-oriented recommendations, which tend, but not exclusively, to subordinate the EU's social objectives to their economic ones. In the later years of the Barroso Commission, we see a progressive socialization which is focused on recommendations addressing social inclusion issues, also various aspects of social investment, predominantly, let's say, in the social policy field. Then we have Juncker coming to power with his commitment to the so-called social AAA. We see a so-called streamlining of the European semester, trying to make it less intrusive and giving more space to member states. We see at the same time the adoption by within DG ECFIN of the idea of structural reforms 2.0, rebalancing flexibility and security, starting to rethink policies towards employment, towards industrial relations, towards wage determination. By 2016, 2017, these kinds of liberalizing anti-trade union, anti-collective bargaining recommendations are starting to disappear. Crucial moment is the adoption of the European Pillar of Social Rights as a kind of comprehensive framework for EU social policy, both in policy coordination and in legislation. And what we see then is that this socialization of the semester gathers force. There are more and more country-specific recommendations related to explicitly to the European Pillar of Social Rights. And then when we come to the pandemic, those feed in directly as part of the Recovery and Resilience Facility regulation into the national recovery and resilience plans. And basically, at that point, I think we can see a big and very clear shift in assessment of EU socioeconomic governance in a much more positive way, not only from academics who had been very critical, but also from social actors like the European Trade Union Confederation. Okay. Now, Roland and colleagues present a different and much more negative story in which not only do they argue against this thesis of a progressive socialization of the European semester, but also EU socioeconomic governance more generally. So the question that I think is worth addressing is why do Roland and colleagues reach different conclusions to what I've called the mainstream narrative on the evolution of EU socioeconomic governance? Is it because they've uncovered new empirical evidence, which other scholars, including myself, had overlooked? Now, I read the book pretty carefully, and I would argue the answer is no. The book reaches different conclusions because of the ways the authors select and interpret the commonly available empirical evidence, especially on the country-specific recommendations issued to member states under the European semester. And for reasons I'll explain in a moment, I find this rather unconvincing. Now, the most positive thing I can say about this analysis is the authors are commendably explicit and transparent about their research design and methodological choices, including their case selection and the coding of the CSRs. So it's easy for readers to see where and why they agree or disagree. Okay, now the first and I think most important point is that Roland and co. adopt a distinctive criterion for assessing the policy prescriptions of what they call the EU's new economic governance as socially regressive or progressive. That is, whether these prescriptions promote or have the potential to promote commodification or decommodification. And that's seen as the crucial touchstone for assessing labor's ascribed material interests. Now, beyond the author's a priori theoretical, and I would also say ideological commitments, it's not at all obvious why commodification, decommodification is the most useful framework for assessing the social valence of EU economic governance as opposed to those proposed by previous authors. Now, I think one can say that there are arguably some policy issues in which increasing commodification may have socially progressive consequences, which support even the material interests of workers. And to take some examples that are discussed in the book, these include desegmentation of the labor market by extending unemployment insurance and other social benefits to atypical or precarious workers, or expanding labor market participation. For example, by extending child care and long-term care services to encourage women's employment, or by offering quality training opportunities to the long-term unemployed and inactive. Now, a second key point concerns sectoral case selection. Here, I think I may be linking up again with Anton. Now, you explicitly state in the book that you focus on prescriptions that affect workers' terms and conditions while in employment, and that you exclude prescriptions about the social wage, especially payments provided by states outside employment that enable workers' subsistence, so like unemployment benefits or pensions, or their employability, education and training. Now, of course, like all researchers, you're free to select whatever cases you want to study. But I find this a very odd and questionable decision, which seriously limits the broader conclusions that can be drawn from your study, both in terms of the content of the European semester and also in terms of your own theoretical framework. So it's limiting in terms of content because actually a large share of the CSRs concern policies towards social inclusion, like minimum incomes, access to services, social protection, and education and training. So if you exclude these policies from the analysis, it's further limiting because the pattern shown by previous research is that the socialization of the CSRs took place first in these areas and only later, from 2017 onwards, on policies towards employment and industrial relations. So if you focus only on employment and industrial relations, you present an artificially limited picture of the evolution of the European semester, and that explains quite a lot of the differences in your conclusions and those of previous scholarship. But even if we take your own theoretical framework, I find it hard to understand why you would want to exclude the welfare state from your analysis, because the welfare state has typically been seen as a critical bundle of institutional provisions protecting workers from commodification by raising the reservation wage and making their access to key subsistence goods more independent of labor market participation. Now, healthcare, which is covered in the book, clearly forms part of the welfare state in this sense, but I honestly can't understand why studying water and transport services should have been a higher priority for you to analyze from your own theoretical perspective. I probably have more material than I'm going to be able to cover in 15 minutes. Yes, I'm aware of that. So I will say that I also have problems with the country case selection, which is overly weighted towards countries which were subject to memoranda of understanding, which bailout packages, which, as you show rightly, that's where we find the most socially regressive and coercive policies. Now, beyond these issues, I think there are also serious problems with the way that you apply your framework to the coding and interpretation of the CSRs. I mean, the most obvious point is that you treat recommendations that advocate raising and lowering wages as connected to decommodification and commodification. While that's clearly, we can say they're socially progressive or pro-labor or anti-labor, I think that really just illustrates the weakness of the focus on commodification and decommodification. I also have trouble with the way you interpret many of the CSRs on healthcare, for example, those which recommend a shift of emphasis and resources from hospital-based care to preventative care in the community. I think that these can be understood not only as increasing the cost effectiveness of healthcare, but also as part of a socially progressive modernization of care itself. And I could go on in this vein, and I would say that whenever you find recommendations which, even in your own terms, you could be interpreted as decommodifying, you quickly complain that they're either vague, underspecified, or could be used to support privatization of services. So we see a kind of pileup of assumptions, which arguably consistently overstates your case and interprets the evidence in the way which is most positive for your own thesis. Now, I would also, if I had time, want to go through what you call the semantic analysis and to point out that here again the focus on commodification and decommodification is problematic because anything that isn't explicitly in its ultimate rationale aimed at decommodification you see as socially problematic. So recommendations which are aimed at rebalancing internal demand in Germany and promoting more balanced growth in the Eurozone, they don't count as being socially positive, which again is rather strange. So one last point and then a conclusion. The last point, which again we can go into the discussion, is that you make a lot about the different legal status of recommendations and their coercive power. I fully agree about the recommendations or prescriptions under the MOUs, but the evidence that the legal status of CSRs matters for their implementation is very weak. Okay, to conclude, Roland and colleagues sharply criticize what's become the mainstream account of the evolution of EU socioeconomic governance since the Euro crisis, which emphasizes the progressive socialization of the European semester, first in social policy, then in employment relations, the pivotal adoption of the European Pillar of Social Rights, and then the influence of both on the national recovery plans drafted by member states under the Next Generation EU. They offer an alternative account of the new economic governance based on the predominance of a commodifying script, despite substantial shifts in EU policy orientations towards employment and industrial relations, as well as to a lesser extent healthcare. And I should say these are shifts they have difficulty to explain within their theoretical framework and whose persistence they question. So this alternative narrative, in my view, remains highly unconvincing because of methodological weaknesses and theoretical biases in their analytical framework, case selection, coding, and assessment criteria. These pile assumption on top of assumption in a self-confirmatory manner to reach tendentious and misleading conclusions about the evolution of EU socioeconomic governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that contribution. So, Roland, what I suggest is 15 minutes, if you'd like to respond.
Yes, please. All of you for your... sorry. So thanks for your contributions. And I start with Jonathan's critique. And indeed, the difference between his conclusions, or his part, and our conclusion reflects a different methodological approach to the interpretation of NEC prescriptions. And here we talk about the phase of 2009 until 2019. So we have also 3 chapters afterwards. And if we interpret, and if you read the chapters of after COVID, we say that there have been European directives in the field of employment relations that point in different directions, whereas we still see a commodifying orientation in relation to the NEC prescriptions, not in terms of levels of investments for public services, but how these investments are used. So what we also do in our analysis, we distinguish between the qualitative and the quantitative orientation of prescriptions. So on the quantitative side, we look at wage levels and resource levels for public services. And this can be higher and lower, okay? But then there is a qualitative side, and just a little point there. Of course, the higher the minimum wage level is, the more you are protected against the varieties of markets. So in that sense, a higher minimum wage level is decommodifying because it takes the competition for your subsistence out of a level. So it sets a floor, a wage floor. But what is more important is, as indeed we look at public utilities and public services like healthcare, that Anton and maybe most social policy scholars didn't look at public utilities, public transport, and especially in the times of green transition, is an important field as well. And healthcare, indeed, we could have analyzed pensions, but because pensions and healthcare spending is more or less the same chunk, a similar chunk of expenditure. So we chose healthcare because we can't do everything, I agree. And as David and others have done studies on pension, and actually the pension prescriptions are not that decommodifying either, as if you read the pension studies done. But what we also look is at the structural reforms, the qualitative side of the NEC prescriptions. And that is important because we see and continue to see NEC prescriptions that demand for greater orientation of public services organized along market principles. So that leads to the title that we have, so more public investment, but for private gain. So in the post-COVID phase, we have now more spending, but the spending has to be spent in a way with increased use of public-private partnership, increased use of a marketizing solution in the delivery of public services. Tuscany did actually stop the in-house provision of buses and tendered that out and gave, yes, there is 4 billion euro given to the French company that is now running Aerolínea Toscane. So there is more investment, but it is done in a commodifying context because it's public money for private operators in that sense. So that's another dimension. But what is also important to say, I don't agree that we don't look at access to services. So we do look at access to services, especially in the healthcare and also other public services. We document that. And if there is, and there are, for instance, in Romania, provisions that say there should be better access for the rural population or for the Roma to healthcare services in rural areas. We document that, and we have that included in our analysis. And here it is why it's important to look at the different strength, the legal strength, because at the same time, so there are some people in DG employment that put in this social prescription. At the same time, we have Romania receives the same prescription. You have to have higher co-payments for access to healthcare. So people have to pay more to get access to the healthcare service. So the Roma people should be helped to get access. So on the one side, we get that. And on the other side, we get a prescription saying, but if you access, you have to pay more out of pocket to access the healthcare services. And so the two are contradicting each other, but the second is based on the more constraining public deficit and macroeconomic imbalance procedure coming from DG ECFIN and not from DG employment. So I think you are flattening the field by not distinguishing the different legal sources of prescriptions, treating each prescriptions as they would have the same legal value. So that is why we think it's important to distinguish the legal base of the prescriptions as well. And then why do we look only at 4 countries? Because it's very difficult to understand the prescriptions. And you have mentioned the most used prescription. Let's have a more cost-effective healthcare system. That's the most used prescription. How do we interpret this? We interpret this by what we call a semantic analysis. So we cannot understand the prescriptions in isolation. We have to look at each prescription and then look in the recitals, look at the counter reports. What is actually meant? Is it meant to do more public services, more healthcare with the same amount of money? Because that could be one interpretation of having a more cost-effective system. Or is it actually reduce the spending on your health or social services and deliver the same amount of services? And in the online appendix of 270 pages, which we will upload next week, which you couldn't have read therefore because it's not yet there, we actually trace each prescription back to its semantic context. And we could establish that, for instance, the interpretation of this more cost-effective healthcare system, which looks ambiguous, what some people have said, in this particular context, we can relate it back to, actually, it's a very clear political orientation. And the second thing is also, we need to look at the policy context. So we could have chosen other countries. We chose the 4 countries to have 2 big and 2 smaller countries in different parts of Europe. But also we chose the countries because of our 5 people, 2 knows the language of each of the countries involved. And that is important. For instance, Romania got a prescription in 2013. Don't do your minimum wage policy unilaterally. And if you don't know the Romanian context, you would interpret that as a social prescription, because we are all for social dialogue. Use social dialogue. But only when you analyze what actually happens in Romanian politics, you understand that that was not the meaning of that prescription. The meaning was the opposite, because there was no problem for the Commission of unilateral action when it was about cutting minimum wage, and actually there were prescriptions to cut minimum wage. But then a social democratic government won the elections and proposed in the electoral manifesto, we will reverse the minimum wage cuts. And then the Employers Association invented social dialogue, or rediscovered social dialogue, in order to get a veto, to block unilateral action in order to increase the minimum wage. So that is just a case why we have chosen countries that we know well in order to see that, how we can interpret this policy orientation. So that is maybe 2 or 3 points to that. Now we have a lot of different points. Why we did to choose communication? What's the point? Are we Polanyianist or Marxist or whatever? And the funny thing is that the first question, so Donatella told we are Polanyianists. Martin Rhodes wrote a review for the ILR review and said we are neo-Marxists and not Polanyianists. And so what I want to say with that is possibly we aren't, that is not, it's difficult to put us in one of these boxes. Because the argument that we do first, or Philip Schmidt will say later that we are neo-functionalists. So we are not, the purpose of our research is not to do, to put us in a camp and wave the flag of one camp. So we really wanted to analyze what's going on the ground. And then the evidence that we show might be used by neo-functionalists to make a point in their favor, but also might go against, so we are not, for instance, neo-Polanyianists because we don't think to go back to the nation state where the society is protecting. So there are maybe national Polanyianists and transnational Polanyianists and then national Marxists and transnational Marxists. So our argument is more to see that we see a kind of a reconfiguration of socioeconomic politics and socioeconomic policy making, and that is now my last reply to Stefanie's point. Yes, we didn't talk too much about competition state, but we did. When we did, nevertheless, indirectly, when we talked about competitive cooperatism, the 2000s, where national settings were kind of social partners coming together to increase the competitiveness, etc. We think what is important, maybe why we can't talk about, so the national level is still important because we do analyze it also on the national level. You have to understand the national context. But what is different is the basis of rise of capitalism, the basis of national competitiveness state is that, yes, we have transnational market competition, but we have still autonomy in terms of collective bargaining, in terms of special arrangements that we can do on the national level. But what we have seen with NAG is actually intervention limiting the autonomy of social partners and therefore kind of forcing a rethink of these national models. And then maybe last but not least, the comment that you haven't put forward, and Anton summarized, I think, in the first sentence, our things very nicely when he described how we see the evolution, but you did it in a macro way. So time period-wise. If I would summarize our work, I would emphasize much more the sectorial differences. So the sectorial differences are important insofar as mentioned with the minimum wage directive and other directives after COVID, we have seen a kind of a decommodifying orientation in the area of wage bargaining and wage policy and labor field. But and we have also actually seen different orientations in the wage field, whereas Germany was actually told, and we documented also to increase wages, to rebalance. So we do acknowledge that. We have said that is a decommodifying prescription for Germany to increase wages to rebalance the European economy. So we have documented that. But what is more important is to see that if we take the page 275 in the book, where we have decommodifying prescriptions in the area of employment relations and especially in public services. So there is no decommodifying prescriptions in the organization and reorganization of public services in the whole period, which is maybe socially problematic, as you would say, but actually it's also positive. You know why? Precisely because all unions, North and South, were feeling that healthcare is kind of threatening them, or that this public service prescription are going against them, public service unions united and mobilized and created a European public sphere, and therefore maybe contributed to European democracy by creating a European public spheres, whereas trade unions in the wage bargaining field, in the private sector, didn't come together because there the prescription was much more went in much different direction. So we look at these issues not from a different point of view. So Anton's work and our work is complementary. So of course the social buffers worked well in Germany after the crisis, so we don't disagree with that. But our Erkenntnisinteresse, our aim was to see, are there common challenges across Europe that would bring labor together to act, to do something together, to create pressures to unite workers and then maybe change the political orientation of EU policy making? And we found them more among public sector workers, precisely because they were facing similar challenge in that field. So that is a counterintuitive result, because most labor scholars in the past have thought that labor unions in the private sector would kind of be driving internationalization because they were more exposed to multinational companies. But we saw here actually the opposite. So in that sense, it can be positive to be challenged by similar challenges. And that was also not necessarily easy, because in contrast to the Bolkestein Directive, and you talked about opportunity structures, in the Bolkestein Directive, it's one directive affecting everybody and was clear. Here in healthcare, these healthcare unions first had to decodify and understand, actually we are facing the same challenges because the NAC prescriptions are country-specific. So it's therefore much more difficult to see the common strategy in that.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you. So thanks very much. So all that remains for me to do is thank our contributors, Donatella, Anton, Stefanie, Jonathan. Thank you so much. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break, and then we're going to start with the second panel. So just literally toilet break, breath of fresh air, and we'll go at round two on this, afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
But don't sit in the balcony the other day.
Don't fall over the balcony.
Okay, thank you very much. But please do not hesitate to let me know if I talk for too long, right? So yeah, thanks. It's great. I've been, I stepped in for the second talk of the first panel, and it's great to be part of this very, very interesting conversation. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I was busy with master's thesis defenses here at ULB this morning. So let me start with perhaps what I think are the two key great merits of the book. First, in terms of scope, I mean, obviously this has been a very ambitious enterprise, and I think the ambition is fulfilled in the sense that it provides a big picture that connects three things, three aspects. The first is policy change in terms of this analysis of commodification versus decommodification. The second aspect is governance, providing an analysis of change over time in the economic, socioeconomic governance regime of the EU. And the third thing is democracy, especially factoring in transnational labor politics. And usually those three aspects are dealt with in three different strings of the literature, with different analytical strategies, different theoretical frameworks, concepts, different methods, and data. And it's very rare. I mean, sometimes you come across work that connects two of those three aspects, but it's not so frequent. And I think connecting those three in this book was an extremely ambitious and does really bring a very valuable contribution, and obviously is difficult as well. Second, in terms of approach and methods, we have here a longitudinal design allowing to assess continuity and change before and after the pandemic and the 2020 turn in EU governance. And this as well, I mean, perhaps we'll see more of these studies in the future, but this has remained, quite rare so far. Covering sectors, different sectors, but also policy areas. And so a general message that I see in this regard stemming from the book is this emphasis on continuity rather than change between the pre-COVID or the post-Euro crisis, if you want, regime and policy developments on one hand, and the post-pandemic developments on the other. And here again, that's another originality of the book, I would say, compared to the bulk of what can be read so far, which has mainly emphasized the change and the differences between the pre and post-COVID situation. And I think that this analysis is now echoing in an even greater way now that we recently have seen the realignment of the Stability and Growth Pact and fiscal discipline regime that has been reactivated with rules that are arguably even more stringent than they used to be. So we also see over time, as time goes by, those lines of continuity emerging more strongly, and that makes the findings of the book also even more relevant. So this is interesting both in terms of policy orientation, but also in terms of governance. So I'm going to comment on those two aspects. And let me start with the policy dimension. I think one of the very interesting findings of the book is that not only can we see marketization and fiscal discipline as two sides of the same coin, I think this was already present in the literature. This is very well exemplified with the healthcare sector and this general conception that if the state cannot do it because it's too costly, then you can find market solutions that should be, more cost effective. We see here a typical EU process of transnational market creation through commodification and competition. So this dimension was already present. It's reiterated here in the book, but also the book goes further and shows that commodification or marketization and investment are also the two sides of the same coin, with the analysis of the policy prescriptions and the policy orientations, notably in the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So I think that this is an original angle into the analysis of the RRF, which is insightful, pinpointing how money is flowing, for instance, into digitalization, but not so much into healthcare, which in fact was, the main sector where the problematic aspects and disinvestment before the pandemic had come to light with the pandemic. I think another relevant example that goes into this line, which is not dealt with in the book, but which could be analyzed to exemplify also this argument of the investment commodification relationship, is the recent, not the recent, because it's not recent, but the very vivid skills agenda of the European Union, the way in which lifelong learning is becoming a new market through, for instance, the individualization of training accounts, and so on, while at the same time, many European countries are experiencing acute problems with their simply primary obligatory education system in terms of access, in terms of quality, with dramatic shortage of teachers, and so forth, and so on. So this tension between commodification and decommodification, and that is dealt with towards the end of the book, is also very relevant in today's agenda for the green transition, for instance, and is very much reflected in the tension between, for instance, the green growth agenda, which is an essentially market-based agenda, and a more so-called just transition orientation, which has a much, much stronger decommodifying dimension. So, for instance, if we think about, the couple of the emissions trading system and the social climate fund, we see that the emission trading system relies on carbon pricing. That's typically socially regressive. And then on the other hand, we have the social climate fund, which is decommodifying, which for the first time introduces a possibility of direct income support from EU money. So that's not insignificant, but it is largely insufficient, only partially funded, and so on. So here very clearly in the current green transition agenda, we see a very similar tension about how to use taxpayers' money in terms of creating new markets and new market-based transition versus investing this money into more profound change, for instance, to change lifestyles and decommodify certain public goods. We can exemplify this also. For instance, should we subsidize, the making of electric cars, or should we decommodify clean urban and suburban transport? So you do see very similar tensions. My point was here in further sectors and processes that those that are analyzed in the book. So namely, I think the lines of analysis from the book can be relevant to further sectoral or further studies. Coming now to the angle of governance and democracy, where here I think the book taps into a fairly large body of contributions that argue very clearly that the European economic governance regime has strengthened the dominance of executives, both national and European, so governments, the Council and the Commission, versus representative institutions, especially parliaments, but also the social partners. What is interesting, however, which I found slightly counterintuitive in the book, is the evidence showing that protest has not waned after the Euro crisis, but that we still can observe significant levels of protests that target EU policymaking or its indirect manifestation and impact. This is important and interesting because my understanding of at least part of the social movements literature was, something that Donatella and Luisa Parks wrote about and other people, was that the intergovernmental turn had precluded in important ways transnational protests. So we see here that it depends a lot also on what we look at exactly, or where we look and how we look, that to a large extent, we can observe protests that targets the EU institutions and their policies directly or indirectly, but that transnational coordination remains difficult, and also that direct protest against the prescription stemming from the European semester is almost impossible, or at least non-existent, due to the very bureaucratic nature of that very process. So certainly the lack of parliamentary accountability is a persisting problem that undermines the basis of parliamentary liberal democracy, and also, in my view, contributes to fuel hostility vis-à-vis the EU. I was conducting recently an interview with an EU official from DG Ample who was arguing that perhaps the establishment of democratic standards for the member states to involve formally their social partners or the national parliaments in, for instance, validating and passing the plans could be part of the broader discussion in EU governance, because in fact those very important contrasts in terms of how the member states take the EU recommendation seriously is indeed problematic in terms of the very low salience of EU policymaking in national arenas. This leads me to two arguments on this topic of governance and democracy that I found more, let's say, questioning and arguable, nonetheless very interesting. The first one is, the trend, the tendency I found certainly in the comparative chapters to picture European executives on one hand versus the labor movement, including NGOs fighting for social rights, as two distinct separate social blocks facing each other, or at least that we did not see much of the interactions that do exist and of the struggles even within EU elite, both executive elites but also elected elites. So I think here there's a room, but we can't do everything, but certainly a room to a more fine-grained, perhaps sociological approach of political coalitions in this regard. The second point is about the critical interpretation of the new governance, and especially the role of conditionality. I read fairly harsh critique of conditionality and the way that the RRF is functioning, arguing that the RRF is not changing or reversing the pre-COVID governance, but in contrast, it's making this governance even more coercive by binding the country-specific recommendations to money and payments, and therefore, making it a lot more difficult for the member states to ignore those very recommendations. So I certainly agree with this argument, but in more normative terms, one is left wondering what the alternative could be. I mean, certainly conditionality does perform a greater centralization of the EU regime with a tighter coordination of national policies. And I will not go into, the discussion about differentiated integration and so on. But given that the RRF is taxpayers' money, you do expect some kind of control. You do expect also some type of coherence in steering a coherent policy agenda in a continent. So those are my remarks. I will stop here and reiterate as a conclusion that the volume, in my view, brings very important alternative insights to the existing body of literature and is a very valuable read. Thank you.
Thank you, Amandine. Excellent timekeeping. Thanks for the engaging critique. So now we move to Guglielmo Meardi, who doesn't really need an introduction here, but as you know, he's professor of Scuola Normale and dean of the faculty. 15 minutes.
Thank you, Vincenzo. Thank you, Roland, for coming here and launch the book in Florence, not physically from this balcony, please, rather than in Dublin. Now, I will start with one point, which I think Stefanie mentioned in an email, that she wouldn't talk about it, she leaves it to somebody else, but I think nobody has really dared enter into that, which is neoliberalism, okay? Which is a term that I'm personally very cautious about, because too often is used in such a broad sense to define basically everything, or at least everything we don't like, that analytically doesn't help that much, okay? But I think there is a potential for this book to make a contribution to debates on neoliberalism. Because what you have, rather unexpectedly, because when people talk about neoliberalism, they all think about United States of America. You have with new European governance, the new economic governance of the European Union, something that gets close to the concept of neoliberalism. That is using politics, using the weight of politics in a way that is consistent with classical liberalism to create a market when society doesn't follow the invisible hand as they should, let's say. And that's very helpful, because otherwise that distinguishes neoliberalism from laissez-faire capitalism. Otherwise you don't understand the neo. But it also problematizes the relationship between neoliberalism and democracy and democratic institutions. Because too many people, when they give an example of neoliberalism, they mention Pinochet. Oh, neoliberalism used the power of the state, like Pinochet. Yeah, but Pinochet is rather an extreme case. Open brackets, tomorrow we have an event here about Chile. I close the advertisement and the new constitution. So Chile is rather an extreme case, okay? It's not all neoliberal send tanks on the street. And what is interesting, often in new economic governance during the financial crisis, they didn't need to send tanks into Greece or Italy or Ireland, as far as I know, but they managed somehow to force the political process without stopping elections. Actually, there were more elections than usual in those years, to force the creation of markets. And through the angle of commodification, which is different from pro-labor, and this I see, advantages and disadvantages of using that concept, commodification clearly is very linked to the market. So it's actually creating markets and market solutions physically. So if you go back to the words that Martin Höppner and Schaefer did just before the financial crisis, you can probably take up that and contribute and somehow complement what Maccarrone and Howell did at the national level with national institutions, and that also outside industrial relations with public goods, what happens. So I think that there is a strong contribution on that, which is a bit implicit still in the book, but I think you have time to enlarge the extent of the book and say even more about that, maybe by adding particularly the welfare state, as it has been said before. I personally don't mind the selection of countries you have, but maybe because I like visiting all 4 of them. But also I think there is, to paraphrase the way you title many of your chapters, you could name the selection of your countries Germany and its discontents, okay? Because you have Germany and 3 countries which really were not happy about Germany during the crisis. I know why you don't do that. You won't do that ever, because you don't want to nationalize conflicts ever. But I think it would be, to me, if you want to sell your country cases, rather than just using the opportunity consideration which you mentioned, which make perfect sense for you, but they don't make sense for the reader, I think saying, well, I'm studying Germany and the discontents of Germany. Then there are a lot of other positions in between, but I take those because I think that kind of relationship is crucial in order to understand how the European Union manages these so-called imbalances. Another strength of the book, in my view, is that, which hasn't been mentioned so far, is the fact that you use some of the literature on multinational companies' governance to highlight some processes in the European Union, which actually looks quite close to what I have also studied in the past in multinational companies, the relationship to the subsidiaries, different forms of control, different forms of benchmarking, the fact that you may have a lot of different policies, but some are hard, some are soft, and so on. Now, to go back now to a couple of points of the book. Now, on this commodification, much has already been said. No? The commodification is not necessarily bad. We can all be Marxists and say that capitalism is better than feudalism, for instance. Although then the critical point is, what about the guilds? Is capitalism better than the guilds, which were a part of feudalism? That may be more problematic. But specifically on the employment contract and employment relations, if you take the recent book by Wolfgang Streeck with the Roots Dukes, it goes back to his classic work on status and contract by saying, well, actually something I didn't imagine in the 1980s is that so many workers would prefer the contract over the status. I assume that status is good for workers, contract is good for capitalism, for employers. Actually, nowadays, we can't take that for granted. If Wolfgang Streeck says that, there is something to it. On what you can really make, what you do make a contribution on commodification is the public sector and public goods, given the kind of sectors you choose. Here, one thing that I think deserves to be reflected upon more is the fact that if you're studying how the European Union deals with imbalances and commodification and work in particular, so I focus on that, then you have the big problem of productivity. So the black box is how you measure unit labor costs and productivity in the public sector. Take Romania, which is, to me, the most interesting of your cases. In Romania, in the 20 years since, well, no, little less than 20 years, sorry, since entering the European Union, nominal wages, not real wages, in the tradable sector increased by 300%. In the private non-tradable sector, they increased by 350%. In the public sector, they increased by 1,500%. So just you see, you look at it, oh, well, public sector workers in Romania must be so rich. Now, the point is you can't measure the productivity of the public sector in Romania. You can't have a way to calculate whether the productivity increased or not. I'm pretty sure they did, because having seen Romania a couple of times, things have improved in some aspects, not everything. But the big problem is in the public sector, in public services, sorry, rather than public sector, the buyer and the seller are the same people. So you can't divide output by input and measure productivity in the same way as you do in the private sector. I think that is a crucial political issue, which is, allows to raise a fundamental critique of commodification, and in the way it is measured by mainstream economic governance, that you have something on, because you focus, you have a lot of insights on the sector and can be pushed even further. Now, push a bit further, because I think there is more. Stop me, you are allowed to stop me, and you're not allowed to tell me what to do here, but today you are. One thing that can be done even more is also the political economy. Given that there is this nice link to the multinational companies, if you had gone down the road of looking at Germany, this context, I think the relationship between core and periphery could have been investigated a bit better. There is something that can be studied even more. Because again, with wages, if you look at what happened between 2007, when Romania entered the European Union, and today, 2023, the gross nominal wages, they increased in Italy by a staggering 19% nominal. Obviously, the real went down or stayed flat. In Germany, it went up by 63%. And in Romania, by 181%, okay? So, in particular, between Romania and Italy, Romania wages were one-fifth, less than one-fifth than the Italian ones, and now they are a half, or even more than a half the Italian one. In some other countries, Romania is really the laggard among the Central European states. Slovenia has already overtaken Italy even on nominal wages. Poland and the Czech Republic, within a couple of years, will match Italy on purchase power. Why is this political economy issue important? Because if you want to study transnational action, we also know from multinational company research that the more diverse the material situation of workers in different places is, the more difficult it is to get, a common bargaining agenda. Because some people are starving, and some people, they want the extra super benefit. They want to reduce the working hours, for instance, because they have enough money. Also, we know that socialization is important and integration is important. The more the economies become similar, the easier it is to get a common standpoint. So your European governance critique, I think, is very intriguing and resonates with some of the research I've done myself. In particular, your qualitative approach in distinguishing between hard and soft, rather than just a physics one. It is true that in many regards, as alternative inclusion policies, not all recommendations are the same, not all policies are the same. Some, they go much further than others, and this is something you do very, very well. For instance, you already mentioned in your response before, you can demand that access to healthcare is increased. If you don't put more money in it, well, then the effect, obviously, the effect is a different one, and clearly it's a soft policy. This is extremely relevant for Italy, because Giorgia Meloni just last week passed a decree by increasing access to health and reducing queues in hospital and healthcare in Italy without putting even €1 towards that. 5 minutes, yeah, I'll manage it. So I'll finish with the policies, with Donatella's topic. I think Donatella left, so I go on her field, even if, I feel I can, because she's not here, she knows more than me about that. If you look at your data on the demonstrations and critique and so on, there is one aspect which I think is not, which is really comes to my mind, really struck my attention, let's say. Between 1997 and 2005, if you look at the employment relations protest, it is quite similar with transport, although it is different in the other two sectors. The large majority of the demonstration were organized together by trade unions and social movements. If you look at 2006-2019, the huge majority were by the trade unions alone, without social movement. That's quite intriguing to me, because it seems to me that 1997-2005 were the periods of the so-called anti-global movement, okay? It was Seattle, all those things, the European Social Forum, and so on. And there was a season, which ended somehow in 2004-2005, which is also when the European Union enlarged. And since 2006-2019, the trade unions did things by themselves, which is quite striking, because most of the literature in the last 10 years stresses how important alliances, coalitions, and so on are. It looks that, from your analysis, that on the European level, the European Union, if the European Union wanted to make the polity more technocratic, they managed it, because they managed to split the trade unions from the social movements. And now, still, the social movements do a lot of things. The trade unions do a lot of things, but they do it by themselves. Occasionally, they may have some relation with the trade unions. It happens on health and water, but on employment relations, usually, they have the so-called monopoly that, according to corporatist theorists, they should have. So it looks like somehow the institutional reliance of the trade unions is still there, rather than in another way. They may be more critical, but they clearly have their own role. That. And what is happening now in the last couple of years has already been mentioned by others, with the directives, not only the minimum wage, but the pay transparency, the platform, the due diligence, and so on. Maybe that very unexpectedly, we can see a little bit of a comeback of Euro-corporatism because of this unusual division of roles between social actors. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Guglielmo. You saved 2 minutes that we can add to the discussion towards the end, maybe.
I had a joke on Wolfgang Schäuble, if you want.
Yeah, please, go with it.
No, to frame these things about the difference between European neoliberalism and Pinochet. You know what the Greeks said about Wolfgang Schäuble when he visited Athens for a meeting with a memorandum, and he was flying from outside the Schengen area? He arrived. He had the passport control in Athens. They asked me name, Wolfgang Schäuble, nationality, German, occupation. No, I'm here only for 2 days. To me, that is, what the father neoliberalism in Germany. And so neoliberalism in the European Union is a little bit different from the Pinochet picture.
Okay. On that note, I'll ask if Peter Turnbull can hear us well.
Yeah, can hear you fine.
Yes, we can. So Peter is a professor at the University of Bristol. You have 15 minutes, so the floor is yours, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much. Well, first thing is I'll just preface what I want to say by first of all saying I really enjoyed reading the book, and my comments are really about how we might dig a bit deeper into some of the relationships that you look at in the book. I'm going to draw on examples from the transport sector, which is the sector I'm most familiar with, but not rail or public transport in cities, which are covered in detail in the book. I'll also say that, or confess that I'm an economist, so I think about things in a particular way, and that will influence what I'm about to say. So I want to comment on kind of three, I don't know, dimensions or axes of ways of thinking about some of these things. The first is how we regulate markets, and whether we regulate the structure of the market or people's conduct in the market. I then want to talk about the horizontal and vertical dimension, both in terms of the policy-making process and also the geographical scale that's already been touched on. And then just say very briefly towards the end, just make a few kind of observations or questions about mobilization and counter-mobilization. So on the first point about the structure of the market, I mean, traditionally we regulated who could compete in a particular market. And one of the best examples of that from the aviation sector was through bilateral air service agreements, where you had an agreement between states that said that only 2 airlines, or they specified the number of airlines that could fly on those particular routes. We opened up that market to competition in Europe, and then you start to see the entry of new businesses, new business models, new employment practices. When we open up markets, we move from that kind of ex-ante, the kind of rules and regulations about who's actually allowed to compete, to post hoc trying to regulate people's behavior in the market. And that's behavior towards other firms, towards customers, and towards employees. And one of the problems with that is that it's much more difficult to define what is acceptable behavior. So, for example, what is an anti-competitive practice? What are the rights of consumers? And you will always get certain companies that will push the limits on this. So when we had the outage of our air traffic service in the UK last year in August, on one of the busiest days of the year, Ryner was very unhappy about the idea of having to pay compensation to passengers who missed their flights because they blamed another party. And if you actually watch you can watch it on video actually, a House of Commons where a select committee called in the chief executive of our National Air Traffic Service, and Michael O'Leary was there as well. His behaviour towards the chief executive of our National Air Traffic Service, let's just say, left something to be desired. Okay, so the problem that we then have is that firms who want to kind of not play by the rules find it very easy to do so, in the sense that they can change for example, the intermediaries through which they hire people. So one of the trends in aviation at the moment is to employ pilots as self-employed pilots. Now, a lot of these people are clearly bogusly self-employed, and they're hired through intermediaries. So there was recently a case in Norway that tried to define or tried to establish whether the intermediary was a temporary work agency, which therefore gave workers certain rights. By the time they'd gone through the legal process to establish that it should be covered by the temporary work agencies, the airline had changed the intermediary that it was using an agency through Cyprus. So it's difficult to kind of keep up with these companies. The structure of the market is often changed in lots of different ways. So if you look at the long distance bus and coach market across Europe. That principally came about through a deregulation of the domestic bus market in Germany, which was previously regulated to protect the national railways. Once you open up that market to competition, the bus market, all these new entrants appear. You then get a process of competition, and then you get one dominant supplier that comes out. So the whole way in which kind of markets work, and the implication of that in that particular case, this dominant company, Flixbus, and Flixbus doesn't own any coaches, it doesn't employ any drivers directly. It uses subsidiaries in lots of different countries. During the kind of the period of austerity that you focus on in the book, in the ports industry in Greece, the government decided that they would have more international concessions, private concessions to international operators who wanted to operate terminals in Greece. As part of that process then, it also included the right of those companies to employ whoever they like, and not necessarily union members or recognised dock workers. So if you go back to the early noughties and the attempts by the European Commission to introduce a directive on access to the port services market, which the dock workers famously kind of mobilised about, you see that coming about in a different way through concession contracts that are being offered by a national government to international companies. So when you get these changes from structure to conduct, it changes the actors and also the way they behave. So again, if you go back to aviation, what we then see is an association of low fares airlines that lobbies the Commission in a particular way to pursue particular policies for that would benefit low cost airlines as opposed to the traditional network airlines. So, in a sense, in terms of thinking about what you discuss in the book, it's basically about knowing more about who these actors are and who is pushing the kind of policy agenda in that respect. And we know that words matter in all these kind of documents. And so the question, I mean, an obvious example would be changes in 2012. Sorry. Threw the phone out of the room. Sorry. So changes in 2012 that for aircrew that didn't simply say where you work, which is the airline that is registered in a particular country, but where you work from, so that you might then pay your social payments in the country where you're actually living and working from. So that takes me to this question of the kind of horizontal and the vertical, because again, how does competition play out between capital and labour in particular markets? So if the preferred approach in the past was through the creation of a single market and open competition, how does competition between capital and labour kind of play out at different geographical scales, and how is that process being kind of implemented through structure or conduct regulation? So if you think about who's competing, we can think about whether firms are whether capital is competing with other capital, and whether that's on a domestic or an international basis. And the same with workers. Is the competition taking place within national boundaries, or is it international competition? So in the case of ports, the whole point about having competition between organisations, the purpose of the Port Services Directive was this specification of at least 2 service providers in every port. So it's a way of, in a sense, creating competition between capital. If you think about competition between capital on an international scale, a lot of that is about opening up the market to international companies. So you can think about concessions for international container terminals, for example. On the workers' side, we can think about competition between workers, where we see all these kind of changes through deregulation of labour markets, core peripheries, agency workers, 0 hours contracts. So can you actually employ people on these different terms and conditions? And then when we think about competition between workers on an international scale, if you think about something as simple as mutual recognition of qualifications, in some transport sectors, that's much easier than in others. So for pilots flying a particular aircraft, it's much easier to get a license to move from one company to another and be certified to fly those aircraft. If you think about mobility in ports, it's much more difficult because then there's usually restrictions on union membership as access to that particular labour market. Now, there are areas of ports where if you think about mutual recognition of qualifications, so if we had a recognition for a contract as a dock worker, it would mean that seafarers, for example, could lash and unlash container boxes or vehicles on a roll-on, roll-off ferry, and therefore effectively take the jobs or undermine the employment position of people in that particular port. Now, one of the things when, for example, the Greek government opened the concessions for terminals in Greece to international competitors, so these were concessions that port authorities were giving to international companies. They actually removed from the kind of concession contract commitments to job security, pensions, training, and also they introduced a force majeure clause, which basically said, if the workers go on strike, then we will extend your concession contract. So in other words, international capital could recoup the cost of any strike by that. So if there was a 1 week strike, you get a week extra on your concession contract over the 30 years that was being negotiated. So we can see the way in which kind of competition plays out through capital and labour in these different markets. Now, I think what's really persuasive in the book is all the evidence that you present about the shift from, that kind of horizontal market kind of process to a vertical political process. And I think what that really opens up then is this whole thing about the strategies of the European Commission as a kind of a key actor in this regard, and how they actually, what kind of strategies are used by the Commission to affect political change. So we're used to the idea of, the Commission putting forward some kind of deregulation measure, and then letting all the social partners, all the different stakeholders propose amendments and come up with what people have called a lesser evil, kind of approach. And we saw that with the ports directives that failed in the early noughties, in the early 2000s, sorry, where nearly all the proposals put forward by shipping lines, port authorities, stevedoring companies were basically accepted by the Commission, and the only opposition voices were actually the workers. I think what's much more interesting in what you're talking about in the current period is that kind of divide and conquer strategy, which becomes very, which is very similar to the way in which transnational corporations would use whipsawing and other strategies to force changes in terms and conditions of employment. Now, the other strategy that the Commission uses, which is not talked about so much, I think this picks up on some of the points that Jonathan Zeitling was making earlier, and also Donatella as well, about framing, is the whole thing about rhetorical framing, and how, in a sense, what you focus on in the book is very much the text. And I agree entirely with you that it's really important that you understand the text in particular national context, the meaning of words, that kind of translation, which I think is really important. But just to give you a quote from page 55, you say, when you're talking about a lot of the technocratic jargon, where you're basically talking about policies being judged on whether they are correct or incorrect, correct or wrong. I won't say right because we, associates with kind of right politically. But what you say is that this technocratic jargon is precise enough to trigger the desired political effects and ambiguous enough to diminish the risk of their politicisation, and therefore, one would assume, counter-mobilisation. And I think, on the one hand, I really like the way in which you distinguish between the qualitative and the quantitative, and then you try and you signify the kind of significance of these different measures in all those kind of tables. But in a sense, if you think about the way in which people like Fairclough and others use critical discourse analysis, if you think about it as like an onion ring, in the very centre you've got the text, the written word, which has been through all that kind of process. So we know this is exactly what people intend. There's no, I don't believe this kind of sloppy things appear in these kind of, when things get to that particular stage. What you talk about in terms of the, the commodifying script is that kind of, is almost like the outer circle that people like Snow and Benford and others would talk about the master frame of neoliberalism, which Guglielmo was just talking about. So it's that kind of, the wider economic and ideological circumstances of the text. And in a sense, what you focus on is the middle and the outer. And in a sense, what's missing is the kind of the next ring, if you like, in the onion, which is the discursive processes, the circumstances in which, the text is being written. So, who's writing this stuff, for example, within the commission, because you focus on, one of the DGs, but for example, in areas like transport, are there any alternative voices within the commission that are pushing a different approach, for example? So it's not just about what's written, but also where, when, why, by who, and to whom is it being directed at? We know all those things really matter in terms of how these things are then, kind of interpreted and the way that the policy is then implemented. So, we're not questioning the fact that there is that kind of vertical, but it would be, I think it'd be really interesting to, in terms of taking the research kind of forward and looking at some of those detailed things and whose voices are being heard in these processes. So, when we looked at the attempts to deregulate the port services market, for example, Grimaldi's voice was, one of the short sea shipping lines in the Mediterranean was being really heard. And again, you see these things, in aviation with the creation of different employer groupings around airlines for Europe, for example. So I think there's much more scope there to look at, who's actually creating the text, both within the commission and also the input from different parties. And
can I ask you, Peter, sorry, I think your time is up, so if
can I just make this one very quick comment about...
Yeah, if it's not a joke about Schäuble, then it's fine.
No, it's just about the counter-mobilization thing, and I was just really intrigued by, what your comments about the ETUC initially organising a lot of opposition to the new economic governance, and then once we had the social pillar, kind of reverting back to that kind of technocratic process, and it just reminds you of Richard Hyman's point about the way in which involvement in that process actually demobilizes people. And again, it would be really interesting to know much more about opposition or kind of mobilization by employers or other groups in favor of certain commodifying policies, and then attempts by others to counter-mobilize against that. Sorry for talking too long.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thank you. Okay, last but not least in this panel, Philip Schmitter, who is honorary professor at the European University Institute. So, Philip, the floor is yours, and I'll tell you when you are 5 minutes away from your time.
There it is, okay. Well, if, and I stress the conditional, if a book is to be judged by the diversity and even intensity of responses, then the quality of this book is assured. We have been hearing some very, very diverse responses, and I will give you a very different one to add to that. I'm not sure whether Roland, when he asked me for an endorsement blurb, whether he anticipated this, but I think of this, irrespective of the substance and the literature which has been constantly referred to on industrial relations, etc., this is a case study in decision-making in the process of European integration. So this is, for me, that's why I read it. I said, this is a case study. And one concept kept jumping out all the time. It's the first, I think the first word of Eurospeak I ever learned. I was a graduate student at Berkeley, and I'd left Switzerland, and I didn't want to have anything more to do with Europe. It's a long story. But the only job I could get was with Erne as a research assistant, and he was the founder of a particular approach to European integration. An approach, incidentally, which is not even mentioned in chapter 3 of the book. So it's not as if the book was designed, so to speak to this particular theory. It's just on the contrary. It makes takes no attention whatsoever to this approach. It discusses several other approaches, but it ignores neo-functionalism completely. The core of neo-functionalism, or the first concept of Eurospeak, that is this language which the people inside the process of European integration were creating to think about themselves, about what was different, what was unusual about it. The code word, in those days, incidentally, was always French, because the entire language of the dear old coal and steel community was French. It was the French bureaucracy which dominated everything. That changed, of course. But the word was engrenage. Now, the word for it these days is something like interdependence, and even more complex interdependence, right? That was the code word. If you wanted to understand European or any integration process, the interdependence between different functional areas of decision-making. You did this, and usually, unintendedly or unexpectedly, something happened which affected something else. So that was engrenage. So that's the functional part. But in order for engrenage to work, you need politics. It doesn't happen just functionally. And that's exactly where this mobilization of civil society, whether it's unions, business associations, professional groups, social movements, etc., and their combination with bureaucrats, both supranational, national, and in some cases even subnational. So that was the engrenage, was both functional, but it was also political in the sense that it brought about this kind of bargaining process. Now, I was delighted when Amandine you're on? Yes, okay. Thank you, Amandine. She mentioned something which has been so far completely also ignored, even, I would say, deliberately so. She talked about a fine-grained conception of democracy. Not a conception of democracy which is entirely oriented around elections, political parties, and parliament, but the fact that people bargain with each other. And the code word for that, and it's everywhere in your book, but it's never defined, I might add, governance. Why is it that this book doesn't practically I don't know if government figures, but governance is everywhere, right? Now, what is that telling us? That is telling us that over time, you have then developed a whole world of engrenage between both privately organized and publicly organized civil servants and various kinds of self-interested groups. So that word for that becomes, I think, governance. That's why you use it. People talk about, instead of talking about government, you talk about governance, and that's a hint of this fine-grained conception that the nature of what we call democracy is different than at least the textbook versions will tell you. Now, when you look at this, this is a brilliant monograph, perhaps one of the most detailed in terms of exposition of this process of engrenage, how you choose to do one thing and it ends up compelling you, whether you like it or not, to make other decisions. And that is, at least in the core of this conception of what integration means in Europe, is this interdependence, this functional thing, but functional depending on the self-organization of those who are affected, and this is extremely important, the bureaucrats, and the national and supranational bureaucrats who also identify these problems and participate in the subsequent bargaining. And this is a monograph about that. It shows how the EU got itself into areas which it was not certainly originally conceived or even formally allowed to do. It spills over. That was the Ernie's, Ernst Haas, the guy I worked for in Berkeley. So, for me, that's what this is. It's a monograph about European integration, and it emphasizes this core process, which, as I say, is captured a bit by this concept of governance. Now, that's all I have to say, is a monograph which demonstrates very, very convincingly how a bunch of interest groups and self-interested groups and bureaucrats combine and expand the agenda to cover items. Whether they do so obligatorily or not, who gives a damn? I mean, it's true, there are all kinds of formal differences in Euro-speak and Euro-practice between directives and recommendations and blah, blah, blah. But that's much less important than the actual effect they have and whether they trigger these secondary consequences which force the bargain with each other. But at the same time, and I finish with this, it is effectively contributing to a redefinition of what we think of as democracy. Just about getting people elections and having political parties present the alternative candidates and blah, 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 blah. It's fine. Nothing's against that. But increasingly, and the EU is, of course, a supreme example of this, maybe an excessive example of this kind of bargaining between public and private actors, which then leads agenda and therefore the process. That's my interpretation. It's completely different than what has been discussed up to now, I think, but I'm very impressed by the evidence, irrespective of who gains and the differences that you've had, normative and others. That's all I cared about, was this demonstration of this core process that is, for those of us who think in this, from this theoretical or this approach, is what drives European integration more than so-called intergovernmentalism or the usual kind of bargaining theories, etc. The real integration is taking place in this monograph. Biased. I was biased but as I say, the word that kept coming to mind, engrenage, if that means anything to anybody else in this room, it means a lot to me, because the first word of Eurospeak I ever learned back in Berkeley in the 60s. So, thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. And I should say that Philippe was the keynote speaker of the launch event we did in Dublin quite a few years ago now, so it's only fitting that he's now closing the panel of the book launch. It is that result of that big project. So we have around 15 minutes, Roland. What do you think? Do we give the, yeah.
Well, 2 or 3 reactions. First, what is funny, the second panel was meant to be a policy panel, but it turned out, and thanks Amandine, from starting with policy and then turning it into the other dimension, which is indeed the governance and democracy dimension, which is, I think, the main focus, was one main driver of why we did write the book. And also thanks for you and Peter. You have obviously being interested, and I can't give you the answer. I can, of course, say something. How is this machine working? How do different DG come together, and who inputs in this? But it is an empirical, really fascinating process, because it does something what Tony Negri and others in the 1970s said, when they said in this transition, post-war this transition, what we see is a kind of society as a whole becoming a factory, and kind of an integration of the whole production and reproduction process in one big kind of thing, and therefore we have to look also not only at metal workers, we have to look at nurses, etc. And in some sense, what the European Union wants to do is it wants to govern everything, because it was understood that the different parts, the different sectors have to be kept together, and if we want Europe to be more successful, we have to integrate social policy, economic policy, fiscal policy, and we can now observe that in this document of 3 pages, 4 pages, where for every year we try to summarize what is on the agenda. So that is an interesting thing. So we only looked at the outcomes of these texts, but of course, if there is need to study the internal mechanisms of that as well, and that is a good research agenda. So, Amandine, I can't answer, but there is a big field for everybody, also in the public, to follow. Second point that you made is continuity and change. You said we emphasize continuity, but again, let's say we do see change in terms of policy orientation, but there is continuity in the governance mechanisms. And one is conditionality. So recently I met Martin Höppner, who was worked up because the European Commission sent back the national plan under the RFF regulation to Germany. It's not acceptable, you have to redo this, and you have to prove that your pension system is sustainable or whatever. And Martin told me, how dare can they do that? So we said, okay, that we have heard that 10 years ago. So even there is a kind of a Europeanization in some sense. So the conditionality, why is the conditionality a problem? The problem is not that of course, we do want proofs that public EU funding is spent well. But if you search for the committee of the European Court of Auditors, they complain about the NEC process because classical accountability, how is money spent in the RFF, is not the focus anymore. The focus is policy conditionalities that has nothing to do whether you spend it on with or without corruption, whatever. So the policy, the use of conditionality, the problem I have with conditionality is not that we should not check if money is well spent, but it is used for other purposes. And so therefore, my argument would be, if you want to have other purposes, maybe you should have a European directive about pension reform, and not using these prescriptions to force pension reform in Germany or Ireland, whatever. Second point, Guglielmo, I don't think it is wrong conception to say this is Germany and it's discontent. Precisely that is something we want to argue against in a sense, in water, for example. So the success of counter-mobilization depends on workers from Germany and other parts, or social users of water services coming together. And so the idea is shifting the debate from a national EU one to one about different policy orientations. And then you have people in Germany or France agreeing with other people in other countries. So that is another dimension. And then you are right. We have seen a continuous rise of transnational protests, and more recently, more trade unions. We will discuss that in a paper that is coming out hopefully soon, based on a transnational database of protest actions. But so that is interesting, because yes, normally in social movement research we have ebb and flows, but we see on a low level a continuous increase, even in the ebb, when protests in general go down, we see a general slow increase in transnational protests, which is maybe there is, on top of this up and down, a kind of a spillover. And that leads me to Peter and to Philip. Peter is the very good example that also is governance related and not policy oriented is his case of the Port Service Directive, because the European Union twice tried to liberalize public organized port services and twice lost, because the European Parliament responded to protests of port workers and rejected all port liberalization directives 2 times. And then the European Commission used then the NEC prescriptions to push the liberalization agenda of ports through this other channel. And the Parliament there couldn't stop that because it is out of the process, and it is actually, so the governance structure of this process is indeed very important. And last but not least, yeah, we had chats, because I never understood myself as a neo-functionalist. I always thought this is too technocratic. But then Philip, when he talked about it, said, yeah, but it's always, neo-functionalism was always a political conflict as well. It is not just a technocratic thing that worked behind closed doors. But it's not true to say that we don't acknowledge neo-functionalist arguments. We do, actually. And we also have a quote, and I stop with that. Okay. That's true. It is true in that sense, but we do, when we do document the paradigm shift within business associations, we surveyed them in 2007, and even talking about governance was too much for them. And we did a study for Eurofound, and talking about governance was too much for business associations, and we documented. We don't want to talk about that. But then after the financial crisis, and we documented on page 27, Business Europe shifted in favor of strong EU powers in labor, healthcare, and social policy. And this was supported by the American Chamber of Commerce, Southern European Capital Organization, the movement of French enterprises. Only the German employers and business associations, BDA and BDI, rejected this thing and thought maybe you shouldn't endorse these vertical interventions in healthcare and employment relations because, quote, this would lead to EU calls for higher wages in Germany, which would counteract the export-oriented strategies of German firms. And in some sense, this is indeed what we document what has happened, because when employers' associations thought they would be able to kill the European Minimum Wage Directive, given Article 153.5, because there's no competence of the EU in pay policy, the trade union leaders, Esther Lynch, who come from Ireland, looked to the employers and said, okay, so you agree that everything that the Commission did in the last 10 years was illegal against European treaties. Because the EU can't interfere in wage setting, etc. And of course, the European Commission is clever and uses lawyers, and the law service has then said, of course, minimum wage directive has nothing to do with pay. The minimum wage directive is based on working conditions competence of the European Union, as was the recommendations to cut wages was done on the competence to assure a proper functioning of the European economy under the macroeconomic surveillance context. So in that sense, indeed, we could read it as a neo-functionalist piece. But what we wanted to do, indeed, we didn't want to prove neo-functionalism right or wrong. We just wanted to document what's going on.
Okay, so
We are 2 minutes away from 5. So if someone has, I don't know, do we want to see if there is some final or someone else also? Yeah. Yeah, otherwise online they cannot hear. But let's try to be brief.
Yeah, I will be brief. I mean, there's a lot I would like to say. I mean, normally I always agree with Philippe Schmitter, whose enormous wisdom I defer to and have learned a lot from. In this case, Philippe, I think I don't agree with your interpretation of the book in terms of engrenage, and this for a key reason, is that it is not a study of decision-making in the European Union. The decision-making actors are almost completely absent. It is not a study of how country-specific recommendations are adopted. Peter Turnbull asked, okay, which DGs are involved, how do they work, who do they consult, and so on. There is an empirical literature about this, which I myself have contributed to. There's also a big literature about how the national recovery and resilience plans under the RRF have been drafted, how they're being implemented, exactly what the role of the Commission is. All of this is basically missing. In fact, you know, when you comment, Roland, about the attempt to show that there was a socialization of the semester in terms of a growing influence of social actors in the decision-making process, you short-circuit that by saying, oh, but that ignores the structural constraints. And there, the assumption is that, again, you know, the legal bases, you know, impose certain kinds of outcomes irrespective of what the actors themselves are doing. So it's not a study of decision-making. It's not a study of implementation. We do see actors coming in, but only the protest actors, only the counter-mobilization at national and at European level. And then, and even there, it doesn't follow out the consequences of these mobilizations. It doesn't show, did they make a difference in national or European policy? So in that sense, the outcomes or the kind of texts and recommendations that are produced and analyzed in the book could well be the product of engrenage, but the process of engrenage, I mean, to my mind, is absent from the book itself for very deliberate methodological and theoretical reasons.
I think Stefanie had also a point.
I mean, I don't have one point. I want just to repeat that it is difficult to speak with each other and to discuss with each other because our perspectives are theoretically very diverse. This is for sure. Nevertheless, I think there was, or there is, I would say, an elephant in the room, which is the rise of the extreme right. So, and maybe for further debate, you can put it more directly on the table, what the different theoretical and paradigms say about that. Then you have a point to bring them together. In my perspective, we have, as I said, continued to speak about fragmentation, socio-spatial fragmentation regionally, but also in the labor process. So about fragmentation of subcontracting, agency work, precarization, a large-scale migration in the labor processes, and so on. And this problem is not resolved via joining the labor market, you know? I mean, joining the labor market is not a success story as such. And in my perspective, so in my paradigm, macroeconomic balances, to put it a bit like a provocation, do more hide than they tell us about the social situation of workers and the majority of the people. The famous case is Germany. I mean, the macroeconomic performance of Germany is not that bad, but the precarization and the fragmentation is high. So it hides, it is hidden by this, you know, statistical data. Last remark to Guglielmo and about neoliberalism, because I like that you took this up, and I want even sharpen it. And this was my critique. I got it when you said that there's a pressure, horizontal pressure via marketization. But in a way, I do not really follow this separation of horizontal and vertical, because I wanted to say that marketization does not exist as such. It is politically constructed. So state and market are not opposite, as Ian Brough, for example, underlines too, but they have to be analyzed together. And one point in addition, democracy, one of the things I think are the most dangerous from neoliberalism today, or for a long time already, is that it turns the question of democracy, so the question of workers as political subjects, into a question of consumer democracy. So workers and all of us, we should intervene in markets via consuming. So the political dimension of democracy is in a way evaded. Shortly said, there are a lot of things to be discussed still, but okay, I stop it.
Thank you, Stefanie. No one else has final remarks. I'll leave the floor again to Roland, and then we can just also announce the reception, I guess.
There is a reception downstairs with some drinks, so I won't be long, and we can continue talking. And the idea of this was we don't want to present what we did, as other scholars normally do when they do a book, but the idea is just open a field and open a debate about this. And for instance, I agree with you, of course, the markets don't exist, and Peter said that as well in his comments. But what is important, I think, to say is that the old distinction of Fritz V. Sharp between negative integration and positive integration, so negative integration, vertical interventions to create markets, and the impossibility of positive integrations because in the labor field or in the healthcare field, because member states will never agree on what they want in these fields, this has ironically been broken by the Troika interventions, and then that in turn Europeanized, for example, wage policy, and now so that distinction between positive and negative integration had become anachronism. And so in that sense, we use vertical and horizontal integration. So we are not in disagreement with that.
Okay, so a big round of applause. One of the usual SNS marathons. So thanks also to those who were connected online, and Amandine already left, but thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the evening.